At this point, I don't think there are many South Africans who haven't at least heard of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, particularly because of what happened at UCT's upper campus, but really what happened throughout the university as a result. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, so my name is Brian Kamanzi. I'm a postgraduate student at UCT. Also a member of the Rhodes Must Fall collective, but I think just generally an aspiring writer and somebody who has a vested interest in Black consciousness thinking.
And finally, Ashraf, let's move along to you. You've written about this topic. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, my name is Ashraf Jamal, and I think of myself as a cultural analyst. I'm a writer and educator. I'm primarily committed to teaching and to transform society through education and in various other forms. My interest in Rhodes Must Fall, as I said, is not because I'm involved in the movement, but because I'm involved in tertiary education and have been for 25 years. And I am very committed to the transformation process itself. And Rhodes Must Fall is merely a phenomenal aspect of that greater transformation.
And I think that's very important to note at the moment, because the process didn't stop with the removal of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes from UCT's upper campus. At the moment in Port Elizabeth, we're seeing that a statue of Queen Victoria is going to be removed from a public space after similar conversations were had in the Eastern Cape. And it all comes back to the very, I don't want to call it trendy, but the well-spoken about topic now of decolonising our spaces. Ashraf, why don't you start us off by just explaining what that means to us?
Well, there's a famous book by Ngugi called Decolonising the Mind, but I have a problem with the idea of decolonisation itself because it's inherently reactive. As is, for example, the idea of Rhodes Must Fall. The idea is, yes, we need to change the world, but changing it in a reactive way alone, for me, is deeply problematic. So from my position, while I'm interested in changing lives and changing imaginations, I believe it should happen in a much more subtle way. And just the mere removal of a statue is not in any way indicative of change. I can understand the symptomatic need to do that because these statues, particularly those of the Victorian age, which is an embodiment of imperialism, Queen Victoria and Cecil John Rhodes, are odious in terms of the contemporary moment, but they are not the core of the problem. And I'm concerned that also in this decolonising process, if we simplify our history, in other words, if we forget the complexity of our history that is defined not only by the interland and transformations on the continent, but by changes via the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, that we are so much defined by a massive history, of which, for example, British imperialism has played its part. So just the glib removal of something, for me, is problematic. It's about educating people about the history of change, and therefore the merits in doing such.
Now that is certainly a very interesting viewpoint on this, but I think many students, especially at the universities, would argue that it needs to start with the removal of these statues. Brian, I think perhaps that you would agree with me on that, especially having interacted with the Rhodes Must Fall movement. Why is the removal of these figures important to your organization?
So I think it's important to say that, I think in principle I agree with Ashraf and that I think that it's about much more than a statue and much more than these issues of heritage. In fact, it's something that we've been trying to emphasize for a large degree of our time with activism, but unfortunately we also know the nature of the media and how it is very difficult to be understood in all your subtleties actually, when people actually only really want to focus on the trendy issues like the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. I think it's important. It's important because we also know the nature of man and how ideas travel, and that we can use ideas like the removal of Cecil John Rhodes to provide revolutionary thrust to conversations. So it's by no means the only or the primary focal point, but by pedagogically talking about the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, we open up a space where we can talk about the nature of labor at the university and how that has been impacted by the state of colonialism. So I think it's also just important to know that this cavity has actually opened up space for subtlety. And this is definitely not a brash, aggressive attack by students who don't know what they're doing. This is at least intended to be a calculated effort to create a more nuanced conversations, one that we are being suppressed from having. And I agree, I think that we often find ourselves in a reactive position, and I really hope that we can, through solidarity, reach a point where we have the capacity to be more than reactive. But it is very difficult when you have aggressors that are determined to uphold a white supremacist capitalist system.